Readings from the World's Last Mysteries from the Reader's Digest collection. The Search for El Dorado, Land of Gold, Part 2. River Conquerors. Ooh-ah, ooh-ah, ooh-ah. Here we go. After having wandered in search of riches for several years, the three expeditions were about to converge upon the Cundinamarca Plateau in the same month of 1539. Even more curious, though the three original forces had been of different sizes and Quesada and Ferdinand had endured terrible hardships, while Belalcazar had enjoyed a relatively easy progress, each of the three armies now numbered exactly 166 men. The three captains warily greeted one another through intermediaries, set up their camps at respectful distances from one another, and finally agreed to meet at Bogota. There they arrived at a gentleman's agreement. Quesada gave Ferdinand some 18 kilograms of gold and emeralds. Belalcazar asked for no compensation, and the three men agreed to return to Spain and let the Council of the Indies divide among them the governorships of the territories they had explored. However, none of the three was to be completely satisfied. Ferdinand died in obscurity, Belalcazar returned to his earlier conquests but died in disrepute, while Quesada had still another scene to play in the El Dorado drama. 2 years later, in 1541, another German expedition left Coro, led by Philip von Hutten. He eventually reached a fair-sized city called Makator. There he was told of a rich tribe nearby called the Omunguas. Hutten travelled on into their land, where he was met with a volley of arrows. But he turned back with optimism. The little that he had seen of the region, rich towns and splendid houses, made him think he had discovered El Dorado. But this was his last expedition. While Hutten was in the interior, a dispute developed about the concession under which Charles V had bestowed on the House of Welser and all the territory of Venezuela between Cape de la Villa and Cumana. While men of law engaged in courteous dispute in a lawsuit instigated by the Vesnas at the Spanish court, a Spanish adventurer, Juan de Carvajal, seized control of the colony. As Hutten was approaching Coro in 1545, Carvajal had him seized and beheaded. 10 years later, the military reality was recognised in law. The Velsas lost their case and the territory. Quito was one of the clearinghouses for rumours about El Dorado, and a favourite starting point for the expeditions in search of golden lands. In 1541, 5 years after Belalcazar's expedition set out from there, Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of Francisco, conqueror of Peru, left Quito at the head of 350 Spaniards and 4,000 Indians. He was looking not only for gold, but also for cinnamon, which was said to be abundant in the kingdom of El Dorado. The expedition climbed in the mountains and then descended into the tropical forests to the east. Shortly thereafter, Gonzalo Pizarro was joined by another soldier of fortune, Francisco de Orellana. Together they came upon a river called Coca, where the expedition, by now desperately short of supplies, divided into two. Orellana took a party downstream in 2 canoes and a hastily constructed brigantine, while Pizarro made camp on the riverbank to await his return. In the next weeks, Pizarro's men made several sorties in search of game and fruit, but this did little to alleviate the party's misery. A warm rain fell steadily on the camp, and the forces became sadly reduced by hunger and fever. Pizarro finally returned to Quito, leaving behind 3/4 of his original force, dead of starvation or disease. Meanwhile, Orellana travelled downstream until he reached a much larger river. This he followed all the way to the Atlantic. In the open waters of the ocean, Orellana continued his fantastic journey, eventually reaching the Caribbean. From there he pressed on to Spain, where he related his epic tale to Charles V. Although the emperor reacted somewhat coolly to the adventurer's tale, he feared the territory traversed belonged to Portugal. Charles did grant Orellana the governorship of a South American province to be known as New Andalusia. Plagued with difficulties in raising funds to colonise his province, Orellana died without ever retracing his route and without ever finding the land of gold or cinnamon. Well, hell's bells. It's just crazy stuff. Right, have a bit of a sip. The next part's called Woman Archers of the Amazon. But on his voyage down the great river, Orellana had come to a tribe whose long-haired woman drew a bow better than any man. Chance had brought a myth into the realm of reality. Orellana gave the name Amazonas, later Amazon, to the river because these warrior women recalled for him the Greek legend of the Amazons. The myth of gold can sometimes be useful to colonial rulers. This was so in the case of Luis Hurtado de Mendoza, Viceroy of Peru, who in 1560 was trying to establish some order in the country torn by recent rebellions and filled with soldiers of fortune. To keep the malcontents from stirring new trouble, he encouraged the formation of a new expedition in search of the fabled El Dorado. So, 20 years after the abortive attempts of Gonzalo Pizarro and Francisco de Orellana, another expedition set out after the elusive goal. It left Lima under the command of Pedro de Ursua. Part of their route was to be the same as Orellana's. They followed tributaries until they reached the Amazon and started down its lengthy course. Soon afterwards, the Spaniards fell to quarrelling amongst themselves. Lope de Aguirre, I'm just going for it, an ambitious and unscrupulous member of the expedition, entered into a conspiracy to overthrow Ursua from the command and permitted his assassination by fellow mutineers. Directly or indirectly, Aguirre was responsible for the deaths of some 80 members of the expedition, which eventually made its way to the Orinoco River and into Venezuela. Back in Colombia, an old El Dorado hand, Quesada, continued to be haunted by the idea of a lake, which he thought must have had treasures hidden in its depths. In 1568, the elderly Quesada received royal approval for a new expedition. Almost all his former companions were dead, but Quesada had El Dorado fever. He left Bogota with a force of 2,800 men. They hunted in vain for 3 years before Quesada gave up. When he arrived back at Bogota, he brought with him only 64 of the 1,300 Spaniards who had started out. Only 4 Indian porters out of 1,500 who began the journey, and only 18 horses out of 1,100. The financial loss was a staggering 200,000 gold pesos. So, for nearly 4 decades, expeditions had crisscrossed northern South America from the Andean highlands of what is now Peru, Ecuador and Colombia to the forests of Venezuela and Brazil. Each expedition had lasted from 2 to 5 years. The cost had been huge, the treasure practically nil. Towards the end of the 16th century, the magnetic of El Dorado shifted from the western to the east in South America, from Colombia to Guinea. In 1584, Antonio de Berrio, governor of a vast tract of land between the Amazon and the Orinoco rivers, where El Dorado is now thought to be, set off from Tuna in central Colombia to explore the hinterland of Guyana. He had become convinced that the Golden Man was to be found only at a lake surrounded by mountains. Berrio headed into the eastern Guyana, reached the Orinoco River, had a boat built, took his men and animals across the river and headed into the mountains beyond. He was sure that this was the area to which the Incas had fled from Francisco Pizarro's invasion, taking with them part of their treasure. According to one current tale, the fleeing Incas had found in Manoa a city of gold. It was this city that Berrio sought. Berrio's expedition was unsuccessful, as was a second which lasted from 1585 to 1588. But on his first campaign, Indians told him of a mountain lake to the west where Meta had joined the Orinoco. In 1591, Berreo launched his third expedition and travelled down the Orinoco. After a perilous journey in which he had to fight off frequent attacks by Indians, Berreo crossed Guyana from the west to the east, then sailed to the island of Trinidad, where he established a settlement as a base for future expeditions to El Dorado. It was on Trinidad in 1595 that he met the redoubtable English adventurer Sir Walter Raleigh, who was searching for new sources of wealth for his Queen Elizabeth I. During some mighty drinking bouts between the Spaniards and the English, Raleigh picked up all the information he could about Berreo's expedition to Guyana, the Orinoco, and the route to Manoa. It is not clear what happened to Berreo then, but it is possible that he was held prisoner by the English, so they could follow the trail that he had blazed. However, Berreo eventually turned up again, presumably having been freed by the English. Armed with the information gained from the Spaniards, Raleigh set off into Guyana to explore the area which today makes up southeast Venezuela, Guyana and Suriname. He would write rapturously of Manoa, the imperial golden city with countless palaces. He would also describe a vast inland lake as big as the Caspian Sea, known as Lake Parima. Raleigh had not actually seen any of this, as his writings make clear, but Berreo had, or he knew men who claimed to have, and their enthusiasm proved infectious. From this time on, men would speak of Lake Parima in much the same way that they once spoke of Lake Guatavita, where El Dorado was said to have held his rights. It was after this expedition that Raleigh published his journal, The Discovery of the Empire of Guyana. It is revealing to note that how little Raleigh knew of the land he was seeking. The Empire of Guyana is directly east from Peru towards the sea, and lieth under the equinoctial line, and hath more abundance of gold than any part of Peru, and as many or more great cities than ever Peru had when it flourished. It is governed by the same laws, and the emperor and the people observe the same religion, and the same form and policies in government as was used in Peru, not differing in any part, and as I have been assured by such of the Spaniards, and as have seen Manoa, the imperial city of Guyana, which the Spaniards call El Dorado, for that for the greatness, for the riches, and for the excellent seat, it fair exceedeth any of the world, at least so much of the world as is known to the Spanish nation. Okay, just carries on out there. After the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603, the succession of James I, Raleigh was convicted on trumped-up charges of treason and sentenced to death. The sentence was suspended, and Raleigh was remained in the Tower of London from 1603 to 1616. He was then released, though not pardoned, and allowed to lead a second expedition in search of El Dorado. This time he claimed to have located gold mines, but in fact the expedition was as unsuccessful as all those that had gone before. Raleigh returned to England, where the suspended sentence was imposed, and in 1618 he was beheaded. But the Golden King himself was not forgotten. The poet Juan de Castellanos, who was a soldier in the Spanish Indies, described him in 1601. This is the king who went without garments, in a boat upon a pool, anointed all over with the essence of terebinth, turpentine, over which a quantity of powdered gold had been cast in such a way as to cover him from head to foot, and which made him shine like the sun. In the evening he bathed in the waters of the lake, where all the gold with which he had been covered dissolved away. It was now the beginning of the 17th century, and the road to El Dorado was littered with corpses of captains, soldiers, and Indians. Except for a few nuggets of gold, a sizable haul of emeralds, and some cinnamon, there was little to show for nearly a century of exploration. No one had found the Golden Man or discovered his treasure. No one had ever seen Lake Parima. Even so, the lake was confidently shown upon the maps. In 1599, for example, the cartographer Jodocus Hondius, on a chart entitled New Map of the Country of Guyana, Rich in Gold, showed a huge lake that he called Laguna Parima, or Dorado, On its shores stood the imperial city of Manoa. Following the publication of Raleigh's discovery of the Emperor of Guiana, Lake Panama was generally depicted by geographers as lying below the equator in accordance with his description. In shape it was sometimes irregular and sometimes rectangular. A French cartographer, Pierre Duval d'Abbeville, showed Lake Parama astride the equator. To the west he had marked El Dorado and Manoa, to the north Guiana. In the 18th century, mapmakers often referred to Lake Parama as the Golden Sea, but after that it ceased to appear on any map. Right up to the end of the 18th century, expeditions in search of the lake continued. But as with all the previous quests, what the explorers saw always seemed to be over the next range of mountains or on the other side of the jungle. One of the last Spanish expeditions in search of El Dorado was led by Diaz de la Fuente. He set off in the Caroni River region of southeast Venezuela, and there divided his expedition into 3 columns, one of which, under the command of Gonzalo Suarez Rondon, was convinced it would reach its destination. According to Indians, they were only 20 days by boat or 2 days on foot from Lake Parama. But a sudden attack of Indians forced the Spaniards to turn back, even though they were so close to their goal. Suarez Rondon's subsequent explanations were vague, and it was then that people began to wonder whether Lake Parama really existed. The Spaniards gave up in search for El Dorado, and at the same time abandoned most of Guiana, leaving it to the English, Dutch and the French to divide into colonies. For a time a sort of weariness kept the explorers away from the dank rustling hells of the jungle, but myths die hard. Sometimes the legend seems to be more real than the truth. Chroniclers of the Lake Guatavita story tell us, perhaps without even believing it themselves, of hundreds of slaves labouring with makeshift tools to cut into the side of the enormous conical crater at the altitude of 2,740 metres in order to empty out the waters it contained. The bottom became visible. Jewels glittered in the mud. A Spaniard stretched out his hand and picked up an emerald the size of an egg. This is only one story among many, but this one is at least partly true. In 1580, Don Antonio Sepulveda, a wealthy Spanish merchant from Bogota, asked the Spanish court for permission to dredge the lake, in return for which he was to pay Treasury 1/5 of the profits. Sepulveda organised an army of Indian workers to cut a breach in the lake wall. Water rushed out and the level of the lake dropped 5 metres. An egg-sized emerald and several gold objects were recovered. Then the breach collapsed. Sepulveda returned to Bogota, where he died before he could mount a new expedition. By the beginning of the 19th century, a quest for El Dorado had passed to a new breed of adventurers, all of them men of science or representatives of business concerns. The first of these latter-day explorers was the Prussian polymath Alexander von Humboldt, whose interest in the Amazon basin was purely scientific. In the company of Aime Bonpland, a French botanist with whom he had originally planned to tour the Nile Valley, Humboldt sailed for the Americas in 1799. In the course of their survey of Spanish possessions in South America, the two would cover almost 9,600 kilometres, much of it on foot or muleback. Humboldt shatters the myth. Humboldt and Bonpland spent 18 months in Venezuela, where their reconnaissance of the Orinoco Basin took them deep into territory that had first been explored by men searching for El Dorado. When the hostile natives forced Humboldt's men to turn back short of the source of the Orinoco River, they made their way to the nearby penal colony of Esmeralda, which stood on the very spot where the fabled Lake Parima was supposed to be. What they found in place of the great inland sea described in Raleigh's journal was a river with the same name. At the flood stage of the Parama River might possibly be mistaken for a small lake, but never for a vast body of water on which the imperial city of Manoa was said to stand. The Laguna Rapunuwini, or Parima, of the voyage of Raleigh and of the maps of Hondius Humboldt concluded it is an imaginary lake. Humboldt and Bonpland's travels eventually took them to Cana Dinamarca, the Colombian plateau associated with many versions of the legend of the Golden Man. They made camp on the shores of Lake Guatavita, a water-filled volcanic crater which was as real as Lake Parama was imaginary. On tour at the crater's perimeter, Humboldt noted the spot where Sepulveda's expedition had bored a breach in this crater wall in the 1580s, but the Prussian made no attempt to drain the lake. Humboldt had no interest in the sunken treasure of Guatavita, but many others did, and the reports of his journey to the holy lake of ancient legend touched off a new way of expeditions to the site. It was calculated that if 1,000 Indians had made the annual pilgrimage to Lake Guatavita for a century, and if each had thrown 5 gold trinkets in the water, as some versions of the tale held, then nearly 500,000 gold objects lay at the bottom of this lake. Such a golden trove could run into the millions of dollars. The race to find El Dorado was on once again. In 1912, for instance, a British company called simply Contractors Limited arrived in Colombia with some $150,000 worth of equipment and a master plan for pumping Lake Guavata dry. Using machinery that is considered highly sophisticated in its day, this group did succeed in exposing part of the lake bed, which proved to be composed of thick black mud and little else. In all, the gold recovered by these expeditions was hardly sufficient to repay the fraction of the cost of the expeditions themselves. Moreover, the most interesting find was the most important for its historical rather than monetary value, and was made not at Guatavita, but half a century earlier near Lake Sicha, a tiny raft entirely made of gold. On it stood figures representing nobles and priests, and one who was indisputably intended to represent El Dorado himself. The allure of El Dorado, the Golden Man, and El Dorado, the Golden Land, have lost their power over the minds of men, but they have been replaced by the reality of modern discoveries. For anthropologists, there was a discovery between 1948 and 1950 of the Maquiritares and the Huaharibos, tribes living in the mountain range. Okay, wild tribes living in the mountain range of the Sierra Parima. For modern prospectors, there were discoveries of platinum, silver, and emeralds in Colombia, and gold, bauxite, and manganese in Guyana. And above all, there was the discovery of oil, the black gold of the 20th century, in Lake Maracaibo basin of northwest Venezuela. Perhaps, after all, there is an El Dorado. Dun, 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 dun.